I make the work for me to understand, to come to terms with certain questions of art and life. I make the work always from a deficit. When in my lecture I was talking about the importance of being an amateur, a beginner. Take, for instance, the work of Ansel Kiefer of the 1970s. That work is his best. Then afterwards, as he becomes more of an authority on himself, which is always a danger, the work loses some of the sharpness that he has. So I try to make work to understand things always, and I always want to start from a whole, from a place that I don't know, and then find my way out of that hole. So then when I put it in the world, in some context, then my hope is to just point to someone that effort. Because in that way I hope that they themselves will find something of themselves in that effort. It's not sharing in the conventional sense. It's more like showing than sharing. But it's not prescriptive in the sense that I do not make a program of what somebody else is going to feel or do. You will never hear me say things like the artist, ask the viewer to questions, issues, that kind of crazy way of talking. And who is the viewer? When people say statements like this, they're incredibly sophisticated viewers that they're not shaken or, in any way probed by any artist to ask any question because they already have asked all the questions, or most important questions. So it's very arrogant, for instance, these kinds of statements of artists. So all I am trying to do is do something as authentically as I can, and then put it in the world in some manner. I've used Beethoven in the same way I'm sort of preparing this project for Dartmouth about Frost. I find people whose relationship between their ethics and their work are, to me, interesting. And then I use them as reflections. It's so hard to see oneself. Like we're mostly a blind spot. So trying to see yourself from a certain way is sometimes good to see it through someone else. And in case of Beethoven or Frost, some of those experiences are heightened. So I was asked I did a number of drawings of Beethoven, who a collector from Germany owned, and then the conductor, Sir Simon Rattle, the Berlin Philharmonic, asked if I will consider doing this for the 2004-2005 season. So, which I did. And I focused on a passage on the Maynard Solomon book on the biography of Beethoven, where he spoke about, at the end of the convalescent period of Beethoven's life, he was bedridden, and he was talking about the sweat-stained sheets. And that image is what created that exhibition, just those sheets. So the bed is a refrigerated bed made out of bronze, which I cooled through a refrigeration system, so it gets covered with ice, with snow, really. And that's why it's called Schneebett. And behind it is a very large painting of a forest made out of tartan feathers. And I created these rooms at the Philharmonic that people would go from the concert hall and listen to the actual music. It opened that season with Symphony No. 9. They come from all that music to the silence, not just silence would be better, with the sound of a compressor trying to keep this bed alive, frozen. And that counterpoint was sort of the driving force of the exhibition. Then it was shown in Leipzig, in opposite to Max Klinger's sculpture of Beethoven. Beethoven is very heroic, and that heroic Beethoven versus sort of this sort of pathetic bed, and then it was taken to Miami. It's the best way I know to come to terms with the world and the questions of the world. Now, it may not be a very good way, but it's the best way I have. The question of what is it for someone else is always, this is a very complicated question. But I can only judge from what I like to see in someone else. What I like to see in someone else is the struggle to be honest and authentic. Everything else, the particulars, how they do it, doesn't really matter to me so much. Whether they come from this or that background, doesn't matter. The best example is the light that comes from the struggle of somebody trying to move towards being authentic. If I see that, to me, it's a great, that light is a great guidance. And that's all. It's very abstract. It's not that I am moved by individual things. I'm just moved by presence in that way. So what I'm hoping is that this work, in some ways, is some sort of testimony of a trajectory of sorts, and that people encounter it and find something of themselves, of their own questions in it. I'm not making any big claims for it because I'm not able to, and I find a lot of faults with it. But I try to make sure it's not compromised by a lot of the things that the art world trying to compromise your work with. I started as an apprentice for a painter when I was a little kid, but I don't think it's hard for an immigrant kid to think of art as a real career. When you're like, we went from Cuba to Spain, lived in total poverty with Franco, and the whole idea of just saying, you know what, I'm going to be an artist, which I didn't know any artist. I didn't know what that means. So I was good in math and science, and that seemed like a reasonable thing to do, and I loved it, and it made me understand the world in a certain way. When I got older, I realized that although there's such beauty to math and science, and I still love many things about it, the kinds of questions that began to sort of come up or that were in storage, I realized that I was not going to answer those in the lab. And what's interesting to me is that the typical way that people think of science and art is that art is sort of a luxury, and science a necessity. And in my own life, it was not quite the case. I thought, I don't know how long I was going to be alive, and it seemed that it was a tremendous luxury to go every day to the lab and put aside all these questions that were hounding me. That seems like a tremendous luxury, as if I had 2 or 3 lives to spare. But I didn't, so it was tremendously difficult. I had a fellowship for National Science Foundation to do my projects. I work at Brookhaven doing research, and my parents, it had been difficult for them, even with fellowships and all that, to put me through school. So when I said one day, in what seemed to my mother like I've just gone at the deep end, that, I'm going to leave this and apply for the Master of Fine Arts, they thought I really had gone. The interesting part is that I couldn't really blame them because I understood. And in addition to understanding, I had nothing to offer as a counterpoint. It was like, I'm going to leave science and I'm going to become a doctor. No, there was nothing to offer on the other side. I was more nervous than anyone that this would be a productive career, that I had anything to offer, that I would ever make a living. I wasn't going to lie. I'm going to say, this is going to be great. I'm the next Da Vinci. Who can say that? So I went and did my MFA, dropped out, came back and finished it, and it took a long time for my parents. I used to send them articles of press, which didn't really matter so much to my mom. She just wanted to make sure I could make a living doing it. That's really what it was. And I was a professor for 10 years, so my science advisors and all, everybody was disappointed. It was a massive disappointment for everyone. And this is the last thing I'm going to tell you. So I'm going to tell you how I did it. I left Berkeley and drove south to a little lighthouse called Pigeon Point, which is in north of Monterey. And I sequestered myself for 5 days in this lighthouse and wrote. I don't even know. I mean, I have what I wrote. And when I came out of that, I had decided I was going to leave the PhD program, which I was working already my thesis. I had finished all my doctoral coursework and my examinations. And I announced it, and really, I mean, surprisingly, there was not one person that thought it was a good idea. So, something to think about. Well, thank you very much for being here. It's a pleasure.